Okay, talking about linear regression, we have here in this problem, it says that a pediatrician wanted to estimate a linear function that relates a child's height in inches to their head circumference in inches. So she collected this data. So what we want to do, first of all, they tell us that we have a linear regression. That helps us out a whole bunch because we'll know which type of regression we're looking for. We won't have to examine our scatter plot and determine on our own what kind of regression we have. We're simply dealing with a linear regression. So all we need to do at this point is go to our calculator and we need to enter in our x's and our y's. These are going to be our x values, these are going to be our y values. And the way I do that is I go to Stat and enter on Edit, and then it brings up my L1, L2, and I can enter in all of my data. So I've got all my data entered in here. And so once I have all of my x's in for L1, all my y's in for L2, I want to be able to sketch the scatter plot. And so I need to do a couple of things. First, I need to adjust my window. So I go to my window, and it's asking for my x min, x max, x scale, y min, y max, y scale. The way we do this is, here's all my x's here. My x minimum value looks to be 25. And so I'm going to put in 24 for my x minimum. Give myself a little cushion below that value. And then for the x maximum, my x maximum looks to be 27.75. So maybe I make my x maximum 29. You'll make your x scale 0. Y minimum. My y minimum looks to be 16.4. So maybe I make my y minimum 15. My y maximum is 17.6 looks like, so maybe I make my maximum 19. Again, just giving myself a little cushion. Make my y scale 0. And then now what I have to do is turn on my scatter plot. So I go to second y equals, and I see that all of my scatter plots are turned off. If I hit enter on the first one, it'll bring up my first scatter plot. And while the cursor is blinking on, I'll hit enter on, and that has turned it on. And I hit graph, and there's my scatter plot. So we had to, if you wouldn't have adjusted your window, you probably wouldn't see anything right now. So adjusting the window is very important. So now I have the window adjusted. Let's go through here and see if I can answer some questions. The first thing we have to do is label our axes. The vertical axis is the y value axis, which in this case is going to be head circumference. Head circumference. And then height is my horizontal axis. And then just sketch the scatter plot. So it doesn't have to be perfectly exact, but I do need to be able to see this basic shape here. So maybe your scatter plot looks something like, if we actually labeled our points first. Say maybe I go from something like 24, 26. Maybe I just go to 25, 25, 26, 27. And then on the y-axis, I can go from maybe I just do 15, 16, 17, 18. Then I can actually plot these points a little bit better. So maybe my first one is 25.25 and 16.4. Maybe that first one goes right in there somewhere. Then 25.75 and 16.9. Maybe that goes in there like that. So that's what you want to do. You just want to plot these points, 27.75 and 17.6. Did I miss one? 25 and 16.9. $26.5 and 17.3. 27 and 17.5. 26.75 and 17.3. Looks like I have another one there. Right about there, it's fine. And then 27.5 and 17.5. So that, if we just do a rough sketch of that, that resembles our scatter plot roughly. Okay? So there's our sketch. Then we have some questions we need to ask. It says find the linear regression equation. So what we have to do is, if we go back to Stat, scroll right to Calc, you see that number 4 gives us a choice for linear regression. And if I hit enter, it gives me my equation. But before we put this in y equals, let's go right over here to C, where it's asking for the correlation coefficient. This is R in our calculator, and the way you get this is you have to turn on diagnostics. So if you go to the catalog, which is second, let me clear this all out first. Second 0. So we want to hit D to go down to the diagnostics. And if we scroll, keep scrolling down there, we'll come to diagnostics on. Right there. Just pass it up. And hit enter there twice. And now when we go back to find our equation, Stat, scroll right to Calc, number 4. When we get our equation now, we now get R, which is our correlation coefficient. The closer this is to 1, the more correlation to this line you actually have. So our correlation coefficient is going to be 0.91. We round it to the nearest hundredth place. Now what we want to do is we want to find this actual line here, and I don't want to have to go into y equals and type all this stuff in. So if I'll go to y equals, and if I hit vars, statistics, which is number 5, scroll right to equation, and hit enter, that will put the entire equation into y equals for me, and I can graph, and there's my line. Okay? So I definitely want to see that, and you would put your equation right here. You could round to the nearest, right here it says 3 decimal places, that's fine. Going back real quick to give a better explanation of the correlation coefficient, the closer this R value is to 1, the better fit this data has to this line. So if we look at the graph here, we can see that this line splits that data pretty good, and that data does model this line fairly well. So, and it should, because our correlation coefficient is close to 1. That means that the equation that my calculator came up with fits this data very close, and that is a linear function. So, answering a few more questions, if I turn this page. It says predict the head circumference of a child that is 26 inches tall. Well, height is my x values, so if I hit second calc, That'll bring up the first choice. Number 1 is value. Hit enter. When x equals 26, or in other words, when a child is 26 inches tall, what's the head circumference? And the answer is 17.02. E says, what is the height of a child whose head circumference is 17.4? So if I go over here to my table, second graph, if I scroll down to examine how tall a kid is when their head circumference is 17.4, right here I have 17.381, which rounds to 17.4. So we'll say a child that has a head circumference of 17.4 is 27 inches tall.